For over 300 years, the greatest palaces of Europe held a secret that wasn't a secret at all. Kings didn't hide their mistresses in distant cottages or shadowy corners of the city. They built them apartments inside the palace walls. Sometimes, the mistress's chambers were closer to the royal bedchamber than the queen's, connected by hidden staircases and latched doors that the architecture itself carefully disguised. This wasn't a scandal whispered behind painted fans. It was a system, a role as official as any court position, mapped out in floor plans, brick and mortar. From Versailles to Buckingham, the walls held the arrangement until the modern world finally caught up and the last royal mistress with official quarters walked out for good in 1936. But for centuries before that final door closed, the arrangement was not merely accepted, it was architected. In France, the position of official royal mistress, the maîtresse en titre, was a recognized court role as formal as the keeper of the seals or the grand chamberlain, and it came with its own set of keys, its own apartments, and its own whispered protocol. These were not hidden women tucked behind the stables. They lived above the king, beside the queen, at the very heart of the palace, and everyone knew it. Think of Madame de Pompadour at Versailles, whose rooms were directly above Louis XV's, linked by a private iron staircase that spiraled upward into a space more richly decorated than the queen's own bedchamber. Or Alice Keppel, mistress to King Edward VII, who became a permanent fixture at Buckingham Palace, her husband politely disappearing so the king could arrive at Portman Square, their relationship so woven into court life that the king's own bankers managed her fortune. This was the quiet, architectural reality of royal life, a world where a palace's floor plan could map out an affair as elegantly as any garden, because for centuries, marriage was a political treaty, but the mistress was a personal arrangement, and both required housing. So how did these women live, mere footsteps from the throne? What power did they wield from their gilded cages? And why, when the public finally began to peer through the windows with cameras and newspapers, did the entire system collapse? Tonight, we walk those hidden corridors, from Versailles to Munich, to uncover the blueprint of a secret that wasn't a secret at all. It's time to open the door. To understand how this system worked, you first have to walk through the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles and look up, not at the painted ceilings depicting Louis XIV in triumphant glory, but toward the smaller doorways tucked to the side, the ones the tour guides rarely linger on, because the most important apartment in the palace was never the king's. It was the one directly above it. In 1745, when Jean Antoinette Poisson, soon to be known to history as Madame de Pompadour, first caught the eye of Louis XV, she was not a noblewoman. She was the daughter of a financier, raised in a world of salons and intellectual ambition, and married, rather conveniently, to a man who understood that his wife's proximity to the king was an asset, not a scandal. But what happened next was unprecedented. The king did not merely take her as a lover, he brought her into the palace, not through a back gate, not under cover of darkness, but into a suite of rooms that would become the most coveted address in France. An apartment that had previously belonged to his former chief mistress, and before that, to the powerful Duc de Richelieu. The rooms were small, intimate, and critically, they sat directly above the king's private chambers, connected by a narrow, spiraling staircase that only he possessed the key to. In the morning he could ascend unseen. At night, she could descend at his invitation. The architecture was complicit. This was the blueprint of the maîtresse en titre, the official royal mistress, a role so formalized by the court of France that it carried with it an unwritten but ironclad set of expectations. She was to be beautiful, of course, but more importantly, she was to be discreet, cultured, and politically useful, a confidant who could soothe the king after tedious council meetings, a patroness of the arts who could elevate the court's cultural standing, and a buffer between the monarch and the endless demands of nobility. In return, she received apartments, pensions, titles, and a level of access that the queen herself could not always claim. And the queen, Marie Leszczyńska, daughter of a deposed Polish king, endured it with the weary resignation of a woman who understood her role. She had given the king 10 children, fulfilling her primary political function, and by the 1740s, she retreated increasingly into private devotion, playing cards with her ladies, painting, and avoiding the mistress's ascendancy with a practiced silence. The two women lived fewer than 100 paces apart, their spheres overlapping in corridors and courtyards, and the court learned to navigate the geography of this arrangement as carefully as any diplomat would navigate a treaty. Now, you might wonder why the king didn't simply visit his mistress elsewhere, preserving a semblance of discretion. The answer lies in the peculiar logic of Versailles itself. The palace was not a private home. It was a stage. Every waking moment of the monarch's life was performed before an audience of thousands of courtiers who competed fiercely for the privilege of watching him eat, dress, and pray. In this environment, privacy was an illusion, and secrecy was impossible. The only way to conduct a personal life was to integrate it into the architecture, to build it into the floor plan so that it became part of the daily rhythm rather than an aberration from it. Madame de Pompadour's apartment represented an ingenious compromise. She was hidden enough to preserve the illusion of decorum, but visible enough to make her status undeniable. When foreign ambassadors arrived, they knew where to find her. When ministers needed to sway the king, they visited her first. Her rooms became a secondary seat of power, a salon where policy was shaped over coffee and conversation, and the king, descending his private stairs, could escape the crushing weight of ceremony into a space that felt for a few hours anyway, almost human. But the system demanded a delicate balance, and Pompadour was a master of it. She understood that her position depended not on passion alone, but on indispensability. When her physical relationship with the king ended around 1750, a moment that would have ended most mistresses, she did not retreat. She pivoted. She moved to a larger apartment on the ground floor, a signal that her role had shifted, but far from diminishing her power, the move cemented it. She became the king's most trusted advisor, organizing the construction of the Petit Trianon, commissioning artists like Boucher and Fragonard, corresponding with Voltaire, and eventually wielding influence over military appointments and foreign policy. The court whispered that she had become a shadow minister, and they were not wrong. For 19 years, until her death in 1764, the woman in the ground floor apartment remained one of the most powerful figures in France, proof that the architectural arrangement could outlast the romance that built it. Across the Channel, a different kind of royal architecture was taking shape, less gilded, perhaps, but no less carefully arranged. When Alice Keppel met Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, in early 1898, she was 29 years old, married to the Honourable George Keppel, and possessed of a social finesse so polished that it functioned as its own kind of currency. The prince, 56 and famously fond of pleasure, was not a man who needed another fleeting affair. He needed someone who could manage him. Alice Keppel could. Within weeks, she had installed herself not in a shadowy corner of London, but at the very center of his life. Portman Square became a second court, her home arranged so perfectly for his visits that her husband, George, discreetly exited whenever the royal carriage appeared. There was no secret staircase at Portman Square, but the principle was identical. The architecture of the arrangement, the house itself, the timing of comings and goings, the unspoken signals among servants, all of it functioned as smoothly as a machine designed by the finest engineers of the age. But what made Alice Keppel truly extraordinary was her relationship with the woman who should, by all logic, have been her enemy. Alexandra of Denmark, the Princess of Wales and later Queen, did not merely tolerate Alice. She preferred her. The previous mistress, Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, had been indiscreet, flamboyant, and prone to causing scenes that embarrassed the family. Alice was none of these things. She was tactful, warm, and so skilled in the art of conversation that even Alexandra found herself charmed. At royal gatherings, Alice was seated near the prince, but never too near. She laughed at the right moments, deflected attention from tension, and made herself so useful that her presence became not a scandal, but a comfort. When Edward finally ascended the throne in 1901, Alice Keppel was as much a fixture of the new Edwardian court as the crown jewels, and the king's bankers managed her stock portfolio with the same care they gave to royal investments. Meanwhile, across Europe, the system was playing out in even more dramatic fashion. In 1846, a dancer named Lola Montez arrived in Munich, and within months, she had brought the Kingdom of Bavaria to its knees. King Ludwig I, a 60-year-old monarch with a deep appreciation for art and a fatal susceptibility to infatuation, fell for her with a velocity that alarmed everyone around him. He did not merely grant her an apartment, he gave her a palace. The Bijou Palace on Carolinenplatz, an Italian-style mansion built at staggering expense, became their meeting place, and Ludwig's expenditures on his mistress soon exceeded the cost of entire public buildings. But Lola was no pompadour. She was tempestuous, politically ambitious, and utterly uninterested in the careful protocols that had sustained the French model. She demanded titles, and Ludwig obliged, creating her Countess of Landsfeld. She demanded influence over policy, and Ludwig, besotted, allowed it. By 1847, she was dictating ministerial appointments, and the court, the church, and the university were united in furious opposition. When Ludwig's ministers resigned rather than serve under her shadow, the crisis became a constitutional one. In February 1848, with revolution brewing across Europe and the streets of Munich filling with protesters, Ludwig was forced to sign an expulsion order. Lola fled, disguised, reportedly biting a policeman on her way out of the city. But the damage was done. A month later, Ludwig I abdicated in favor of his son, his reign shattered not by war or famine, but by the architecture of an affair that had consumed the state. The palace he had built for her remained, a monument to the risk of placing a mistress's door too close to the levers of power. Yet these women, for all their differences, shared one fundamental reality. Whether at Versailles, at Buckingham, or in Munich, their apartments were never truly private. They were public instruments, tools of statecraft and status, places where influence was calibrated in the distance between two doorways. The question that hung over all of it, whispered from maid to valet, from minister to queen, was whether the system could survive the one force it could never control, the public gaze. Because as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, something shifted. Newspapers grew bolder, cameras became portable, and the careful discretion that had protected royal arrangements for centuries began to fray at the edges. The walls that had once hidden secret staircases were suddenly made of glass, and the people outside were pressing their faces against it, demanding to see inside. And one woman, more than any other, would discover what happens when the architecture of secrecy collapses entirely and the world finally sees what the floor plans had always tried to hide. The woman who would learn this lesson first was not a stranger to the architecture of royal secrecy. She lived inside it, breathed it, and profited from it more lucratively than almost any mistress in European history. Her name was Alice Keppel, and by the time Edward VII died in 1910, she had become so deeply embedded in the machinery of the British court that her departure from it was less an eviction than a dismantling of an entire wing of the royal household. But before we watch her leave, we need to understand the unique system she mastered, because Alice Keppel didn't just occupy a room near the king. She occupied a role that the British monarchy had refined into something far more durable than the French model, something built not on golden staircases and titled apartments, but on social engineering so precise that even the Queen smiled at her across the dining table. And the day that system began to crack was the day a photograph appeared on the front page of a newspaper, and the public finally saw what the architecture had been hiding for 3 centuries. Let's go back to 1898, when Alice Keppel first entered the orbit of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. She was stepping into a court that had already turned the management of royal mistresses into a kind of performance art. The prince, known universally as Bertie, had a long and dedicated history of extramarital enthusiasm. Before Alice, there was Lily Langtry, the Jersey-born beauty who became his first acknowledged mistress in the late 1870s. Lily Langtry was more than a scandal. She was a phenomenon. The press called her the Jersey Lily, and her face appeared on postcards, in shop windows, in the illustrated papers that were just beginning to reach a mass audience. She induced, as one historian put it, the same sort of hysteria as is today, associated with the most famous film stars. But what matters for our story is where Bertie housed her. He didn't tuck Lily Langtry into a corner of Buckingham Palace. He built her an entire house. The Red House in Bournemouth, constructed in 1877, was designed to Lily's own specifications, a private retreat where the prince could visit with a minimum of theatrical subterfuge. He even arranged for her to be presented at court to his mother, Queen Victoria, an act of audacity that Victoria, famously unamused, endured with tight-lipped resignation. The Red House wasn't a palace apartment, but it was an architectural extension of the royal world, a satellite residence that served the same purpose as Pompadour's rooms above Louis XV. It made the invisible relationship visible enough to be managed, while keeping it just distant enough to preserve the fiction of royal propriety. Lily Langtry's affair with Bertie lasted roughly 3 years, and when it ended, she did what many royal mistresses did. She leveraged her fame into a career, becoming an actress and a businesswoman, her notoriety now a marketable asset. But the template she left behind, the arrangement of a house, a staff, a husband who conveniently looked the other way, became the standard for what came next. By the time Alice Keppel arrived 2 decades later, the system had been refined to the point of elegance. Alice understood something that Lily Langtry, for all her star power, had never quite grasped, that the real currency in this world wasn't beauty or even affection, it was information. And she positioned herself at the intersection of the king's private life and the state's public machinery with a skill that would make any modern political operative weep with envy. Her house at 30 Portman Square became, in effect, an annex of the palace. The arrangement was so well practiced that it functioned like a diplomatic protocol. George Keppel, Alice's husband, was a genial and accommodating man who had long since accepted that his marriage operated on unusual terms. When the king's carriage was spotted approaching, George would quietly exit through a side door, leaving his wife to receive the monarch with the calm efficiency of a prime minister greeting a foreign dignitary. The servants knew not to speak. The neighbors knew not to notice. And inside, Alice had created an environment so perfectly calibrated to the king's needs that he spent more waking hours at Portman Square than in his own official residences. What did she provide that the palace could not? An absence of pressure. Edward VII was a man crushed by the expectations of a mother who had never quite believed he was fit to rule, and by a court that watched his every move for signs of the scandal that had dogged his youth. Alice offered conversation that never demanded, companionship that never judged, and a rare skill for translating the tedious complexities of state documents into amusing anecdotes. She made politics palatable, and in doing so, she made herself indispensable. The power that flowed from this arrangement was not merely social, it was financial and constitutional. Alice Keppel became, as the research now shows, a conduit between the king and his government. When the Foreign Office found itself at odds with the monarch, it was Alice who presented the alternative viewpoint, softening the king's resistance with the same deftness she used to manage a dinner party. The Viceroy of India specifically noted that ministers used her influence to present their cases when official channels failed, and the king, far from resenting this, rewarded her lavishly. He gave her shares in a rubber company worth £50,000, equivalent to roughly £7.5 million today, and directed his personal bankers at Coutts to manage her financial affairs as if she were a member of his own family. This was not a secret kept in shadows. This was a shadow institution, an unofficial ministry of intimacy operating in plain sight but governed by an unspoken rule. As long as everyone pretended not to see it, the architecture would hold. And it held because Alice Keppel understood a truth that would later be forgotten by the woman who brought the entire system crashing down. The truth was this: discretion was not about hiding. It was about choreographing visibility. Alice appeared at every major royal function. She sat near the king at dinners, but not so near that the seating chart screamed mistress. She laughed at his jokes, but never so loudly that anyone felt compelled to glance at the queen. She was, in the words of one contemporary, an honorary man, a woman who had erased the threatening aspects of her role so completely that even the king's wife found her presence soothing. Queen Alexandra, who had suffered the humiliation of Bertie's earlier, more flamboyant affairs, discovered in Alice a strange ally. They exchanged gifts. They shared confidences. When the king was ill or irritable, it was Alice who calmed him, sparing Alexandra the exhausting work of managing a difficult husband. This was the genius of the Edwardian model. The mistress became an asset to the marriage, rather than a threat to it, a pressure valve that allowed the royal family to function smoothly while the king's personal appetites were fed elsewhere. But even genius has an expiration date, and the system that Alice Keppel had perfected contained within it a fatal flaw, one that had nothing to do with private staircases or secret keys, and everything to do with the machine that was beginning to hum outside the palace gates. The mass circulation press. By the time Edward VII died in May 1910, the newspapers that had once contented themselves with respectful sketches of royal garden parties were now hungry for photographs, scandals, and the kind of intimate detail that had previously been the exclusive property of court insiders. When the king's body lay in state, Alice Keppel was permitted a private moment of farewell, a testament to the depth of her integration into the family. But the era of private farewells was ending. The public wanted to know who she was. They wanted to see her face. They wanted to understand the geography of the affair: the house on Portman Square, the bank accounts, the shares, the whispered influence. And the press was no longer willing to pretend it didn't see. After Edward's death, Alice Keppel and her husband became, as one historian put it, quaint relics of a bygone time. She lived on, comfortably wealthy, her investments managed by the same Coutts bankers who had served the king, her memories a private archive of a world that was rapidly being dismantled. But her retirement was punctuated by an event in 1936 that would prove, definitively, that the 300-year-old system of architecturally housed royal mistresses was dead. A new king, Edward VIII, had fallen in love with an American divorcee named Wallis Simpson. And unlike Alice Keppel, Wallis Simpson could not be housed in a satellite apartment or integrated into the court's choreography of discretion, because she was not the sort of woman who could be a mistress. She wanted to be queen. Here is where the architecture finally failed. For centuries, the arrangement had relied on an unspoken contract. The mistress would receive housing, wealth, and influence, but she would never, under any circumstances, claim the public title of wife. The walls that separated the mistress's apartment from the queen's bedchamber were not merely physical. They were constitutional. A king could have a mistress in the palace, but he could not make her queen. When Edward VIII demanded exactly that, the entire structure collapsed. The government, the Church of England, and the press all converged in a crisis that ended not with a new apartment being built, but with the king leaving the building entirely, abdicating the throne for the woman he loved. Alice Keppel, observing from the sidelines, remarked with the weary wisdom of a retired professional, "Things were done much better in my day." She was right. They were. But the death of the system was not instantaneous. It happened in stages, and to understand why the walls finally crumbled, we have to look at the other courts of Europe, where the architecture of royal mistresses was being challenged not by photographs and headlines, but by revolution itself. Because while Alice Keppel was managing Edward VII in London, a dancer named Lola Montez was tearing the Kingdom of Bavaria apart, not with the subtle tools of information and discretion, but with the blunt force of personality and an absolute refusal to inhabit the quiet spaces the architecture had built for her. Her story is the warning that the European monarchies ignored, and it begins with a king who looked at Versailles and decided that one palace for his mistress was not enough. He would give her a mansion, a title, and the keys to the state itself. And the consequences of that decision would echo through every royal court in Europe until the very last hidden staircase was sealed. The dancer who brought down a kingdom arrived in Munich in 1846 with nothing but a pair of dark eyes, a talent for performance, and a complete disregard for the rules that had governed royal mistresses for centuries. Her name was Lola Montez, though she had been born Eliza Gilbert in Ireland, and by the time she stepped onto the stage of the Bavarian capital, she had already reinvented herself so many times that even she might have struggled to trace the line between fact and fiction. She claimed to be a Spanish dancer, though her accent slipped more often than it held. She claimed aristocratic lineage, though the details shifted with every telling. What she really possessed, and what King Ludwig I could not resist, was a kind of gravitational pull that warped the space around her. Men did not merely admire Lola Montez, they restructured their lives to orbit her, and Ludwig, at 60 years old and deeply dissatisfied with the bureaucratic machinery of his own kingdom, was primed to fall harder than any of them. Their first meeting has become the stuff of Bavarian legend. Ludwig, who prided himself on being a patron of the arts and a connoisseur of beauty, summoned her to the palace after hearing reports of her performances. When she arrived, he looked at her, or so the story goes, and asked a question that no monarch had ever asked a dancer before. He pointed to her corseted waist and inquired whether it was real. Lola Montez, without hesitating, took a pair of scissors from the table, cut the laces of her dress, and let the fabric fall. She was, in every way, genuine. Ludwig was lost. Within weeks, she had become the most powerful woman in Bavaria. The king, who had previously expressed his affections through poetry and patronage, now turned to construction. He bought her a mansion on Berrestrasse, a handsome residence where they could meet with a minimum of court interference, but that was only the beginning. He then commissioned the Bijou Palace on Carolinenplatz, an Italian-style gem of a building designed specifically for her, its interiors decorated at an expense so staggering that historians later calculated the costs exceeded those of the Feldherrnhalle, the iconic public building on Odeonsplatz that still stands as a symbol of Munich's civic pride. The message could not have been clearer. Lola Montez was not merely a mistress housed in a convenient apartment. She was a public project, an architectural statement that this woman was as essential to the kingdom as its monuments. And then came the titles. Ludwig ennobled her as Countess of Landsfeld and Baroness of Rosenthal, granting her an annuity of 20,000 florins a year and a place in the Bavarian peerage that enraged the old aristocracy. These were not the quiet financial arrangements of Alice Keppel's London. They were provocations, flung like gauntlets at the feet of the court, the church, and the university. Lola, for her part, embraced the role with a theatricality that would have been comic if its consequences were not so severe. She rode through the streets of Munich on a white horse, smoking a cigar, dressed in black, accompanied by a dog with a jeweled collar. She attended cabinet meetings. When the professors at the University of Munich protested her influence, she demanded that Ludwig dismiss them, and when he hesitated, she reportedly stormed into his study and threw a tantrum that echoed through the palace corridors. The king, unable or unwilling to refuse her, began purging his government of anyone who opposed the new countess. But the real architecture of this disaster was not the Bijou Palace or the mansion on Berrestrasse. It was the way Lola Montez rewired the connection between the king and his state, and she did so without the one tool that had always preserved the system, discretion. Unlike Alice Keppel, who used her influence behind closed doors, whispering counsel to a monarch who could then present decisions as his own, Lola wanted credit. She wanted the world to know that she was the power behind the throne, and the world, increasingly, noticed. The political opposition in Bavaria coalesced around a simple, devastating charge. The king had surrendered his sovereignty to a foreign adventuress. The press, still in its infancy, but growing bolder by the month, printed caricatures of Ludwig as a puppet with Lola pulling the strings. Students rioted. The clergy thundered from pulpits. By February 1848, with revolution sweeping across Europe and the barricades going up in Paris, the streets of Munich were in chaos, and the crowd had one demand: the expulsion of Lola Montez. Ludwig resisted. He loved her. He had built palaces for her, written poems to her, altered his will in her favor. The idea of sending her away was unthinkable, but the pressure was now structural, not personal. His ministers had resigned. His army was unreliable. The city was ungovernable as long as she remained. On February 11th, 1848, he signed the order of expulsion. Lola fled, disguised, reportedly biting a policeman on the hand as she was escorted out of the city, but the humiliation did not end there. She returned the following month, slipping back into Munich in defiance of the ban, and the renewed unrest sealed Ludwig's fate. He had lost the confidence of his people, and on March 20th, 1848, he abdicated in favor of his son, Maximilian II, becoming the first European monarch to lose his throne directly because of his mistress's architecture of influence. The Bijou Palace remained, a beautiful shell of a failed experiment, later repurposed and eventually destroyed in the Second World War. But its ghost lingered over every royal court in Europe as a warning. When you build a palace for your mistress, you build a monument to your own potential downfall. The Lola Montez catastrophe exposed the underlying fragility of the entire system. The French model, the British model, the Bavarian disaster, all were variations on a single precarious equation. The mistress's power was proportional to her proximity to the monarch, but that same proximity, if mismanaged, could become a contagion that infected the monarchy itself. The difference between success and failure lay entirely in the personality of the woman and the architecture of discretion that surrounded her. Pompadour survived because she transitioned from lover to advisor. Alice Keppel thrived because she made herself invisible inside the visible. Lola Montez destroyed because she demanded the spotlight. And the spotlight, when it hits a palace, reveals cracks that no amount of gilding can hide. But the 19th century had one more lesson to offer, a subtler one, about what happens when a royal mistress outlives her architectural purpose and becomes, instead, a public commodity. To understand that, we have to return to the woman whose face launched 1,000 postcards, Lily Langtry, the Jersey Lily, and the house that Edward VII built for her in Bournemouth. Because Lily Langtry didn't vanish after her affair with Bertie ended. She transformed. And her transformation was a preview of the mass media age that would eventually swallow the palaces whole. When Lily Langtry's relationship with the Prince of Wales cooled around 1880, she was still a young woman with a famous face and no reliable source of income. The prince, to his credit, did not abandon her to poverty. He had already built the Red House, a secluded retreat on the Dorset coast where they had spent their most private hours, and he allowed her to keep the property. But Lily needed more than a house. She needed a career. At the suggestion of the prince himself, or perhaps his friends, she turned to the stage. The debut was in 1881 at the Haymarket Theatre in London, and it was, by all accounts, a triumph of celebrity over talent. The critics were divided on her acting ability, but the public was utterly entranced. They didn't come to see her perform Shakespeare. They came to see the woman who had captivated a future king, sitting in a box, acknowledging the crowd, her private life now a public performance. Within a few years, Lily Langtry was touring the United States, her name a brand, her face on cigar boxes and soap advertisements. She had, in effect, become the first royal mistress to industrialize her notoriety. What makes this relevant to our story of architecture is not the acting career itself, but what it signaled. Lily Langtry's fame was a product of the same forces that would eventually make the hidden apartments impossible. The mass circulation press, the illustrated papers, the public's insatiable appetite for the private lives of the powerful. When she had been merely the occupant of a house in Bournemouth, her existence was a rumor, a whispered scandal among the upper classes. But once her face was on newsstands from London to New York, the architecture of discretion became irrelevant. There was no hidden staircase that could protect her from a camera. No secret door could shield her from a reporter with a notebook. The walls that had guarded royal mistresses for centuries were now porous, and the public, given a taste of intimacy, demanded more. This was the fault line that ran beneath all the other cases. The French court at Versailles had existed in a closed system, its secrets protected by the sheer distance between the palace and the people. Even when the revolutionaries stormed the gates in 1789, they were storming a physical building, not a public narrative. But by the late 19th century, the monarchy was no longer a sealed structure. It was a glass house, and the glass was getting thinner every year. Cameras became portable. Telegraphs carried news across continents in hours. The gossip columns that had once been the private entertainment of the aristocracy were now printed for the masses. And the royals themselves, slow to understand the magnitude of the shift, continued to behave as if the walls were still opaque. Alice Keppel was the last person to operate the old system successfully, and she did so in large part because King Edward VII died before the press could fully weaponize her story against the crown. He passed away on May 6, 1910, after a series of heart attacks, and Alice, devastated, was granted a private audience with his body before the public viewing. It was a moment of genuine grief, but also the end of an era. The new king, George V, was a far more conservative figure, deeply devoted to his wife, Mary, and thoroughly uninterested in the ostentatious infidelities that had characterized his father's reign. The position of official mistress, which had survived from Charles VII to Louis XV in France, and from Charles II to Edward VII in Britain, simply ceased to be filled. The apartments that might have housed a new favorite remained empty, their functions absorbed by a monarchy that now understood, perhaps too well, the cost of visibility. But the architecture didn't vanish overnight. The palaces still stood, their floor plans still bore the traces of the old arrangement. At Versailles, the rooms above Louis XV's chambers, once occupied by Madame de Pompadour and later by Madame du Barry, were repurposed into museum spaces, their private staircases sealed or removed. At Buckingham Palace, the private apartments that had witnessed decades of whispered comings and goings were quietly renovated, their histories erased by fresh paint and new wallpaper. The Red House in Bournemouth eventually passed out of royal hands and became, for a time, a hotel, its scandalous origins reduced to a footnote in a local tourist brochure. The architecture of the arrangement was dismantled piece by piece, not with a single dramatic gesture, but with a slow, bureaucratic efficiency of institutions that had learned to bury their past. Yet the true end of the system came not from renovation, but from revolution, not the political kind that had stormed the Bastille and guillotined a king, but the social kind that swept through the 20th century and redefined the relationship between monarchy and public. The event that proved, conclusively, that the old model was dead occurred in 1936, when a man named Edward VIII, having inherited the throne only months earlier, informed his prime minister that he intended to marry the woman he loved. Wallis Simpson was not a royal mistress in the traditional sense. She had never been housed in a palace apartment, never received a title, never been integrated into the court's choreographed visibility. She was an American, twice divorced, and she had no interest in the discreet, satellite existence that Alice Keppel had mastered. She wanted to be queen. The crisis that followed was the most severe constitutional challenge the British monarchy had faced since the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, informed the king that the government would resign if the marriage proceeded. The Church of England, of which Edward was the titular head, forbade the remarriage of divorced persons while former spouses were still living. The Dominion governments expressed their opposition. The press, which had initially shown unusual restraint in reporting on the matter, soon erupted in a frenzy when the story finally broke, and Edward, faced with a choice between the throne and the woman he loved, chose Wallis. On December 11, 1936, Edward VIII announced his abdication in a radio broadcast heard around the world. He said he had found it impossible to bear the heavy burden of responsibility and discharge his duties as king without the help and support of the woman he loved. The speech was moving, poetic, and utterly catastrophic for the institution that had spent centuries managing the tension between public duty and private desire. The architecture that had once allowed a king to house his mistress inside the palace while his queen slept down the hall was now exposed as a relic of a world that no longer existed. The new king, George VI, and his queen, Elizabeth, represented a different model. Devoted, domestic, resolutely middle class in their morality. The hidden staircases were sealed, the satellite houses sold, and the position of official royal mistress, which had structured the intimate life of European monarchy for 300 years, was officially extinct. But what drove this extinction was not merely a change in royal attitudes. It was the relentless advance of a technology that the monarchs of Versailles and Buckingham could never have imagined. The camera, the photograph, and later the newsreel transformed the palace from a closed world of curated appearances into a stage where every gesture was recorded and broadcast. Madame de Pompadour had navigated a court where gossip traveled at the speed of a whisper and was contained by the palace walls. Alice Keppel had managed a press that could be controlled through judicious relationships with editors and the implicit threat of social ostracism. But by the 1930s, the media had become a force that the monarchy could no longer contain. The photographs of Edward and Wallis on holiday, their faces radiant with a love that defied convention, were not taken by court painters. They were snapped by anonymous photographers and sold to agencies that distributed them globally within days. The public saw everything, and what they saw was a king who had chosen a woman over a throne, a choice that might have been managed in the days of Louis XV with a quiet apartment and a private staircase, but was now, in the glare of the flashbulb, a crisis that toppled a reign. The last royal mistress with claims to official quarters left her apartment not in 1936, but in the years that followed, as the old guard of the Edwardian court passed away. Alice Keppel herself lived until 1947, long enough to see the abdication, long enough to witness the coronation of George VI, and long enough to understand that the world she had navigated with such exquisite skill was now a historical curiosity. Her great-granddaughter, Camilla Shand, would later marry Prince Charles, the future King Charles III, and become queen consort in a union that would have been impossible in Alice's day, not because the love was any less real, but because the rules had changed so completely that a former mistress could now become a wife without provoking a constitutional crisis. The architecture had not merely been dismantled, it had been inverted. The hidden staircase was now a public aisle. The private apartment was now a shared palace. The journey from Versailles to Buckingham, from Pompadour to Camilla, traced an arc that was as much about buildings as about behavior. The walls that had once housed official mistresses were now silent, their stories buried in floor plans and architectural drawings, their secrets known only to the historians who were willing to look past the gilt and the portraits and see the geometry of power that had shaped the lives within. But the question that lingered, the question that still draws us to those quiet corridors and sealed staircases, is whether the architecture ever truly loses its power, or whether it simply waits, dormant, for a new kind of arrangement to fill its rooms. Because the buildings are still there, the palaces still stand. The apartments, now repurposed into galleries and offices, still bear the imprint of the lives they once contained. And if you stand in the right corner of Versailles or walk the hushed halls of Buckingham Palace, you might still feel the faint echo of a door closing on a staircase that only a king was allowed to climb. The system is gone. The walls remember, and in the next chapter we'll see how they finally came down and what was left behind in the silence after the last mistress walked away. The dismantling of that architecture was not a single dramatic demolition. It was a slow, almost embarrassed retreat from 3 centuries of accepted practice, carried out one room at a time, one staircase at a time, one newspaper headline at a time, until the whole grand apparatus of official royal mistresses was reduced to a handful of historical footnotes and a few sealed doors that the tour guides no longer mention. To understand how completely the system collapsed, you have to walk through the palaces as they are now and notice what is missing. At Versailles, the apartment that once housed Madame de Pompadour, the very rooms above the king's bedchamber that had served as the template for every royal mistress arrangement that followed, is today a museum gallery, its walls hung with paintings of the very courtiers who once whispered about her. The private iron staircase that Louis XV used to ascend to her rooms in secrecy has been removed, its entrance plastered over, its memory surviving only in architectural drawings that historians occasionally pull from the archives. When the French Revolution swept through the palace in 1789, the revolutionaries did not specifically target the mistress's quarters. They were too busy targeting the monarchy itself. But the apartments that had once signified the king's personal indulgence became, in the new order, simply more gilded rooms to be catalogued and repurposed. What had been a seat of intimate power became a piece of public property, its secrets neutralized by the sheer force of regime change. At Buckingham Palace, the erasure was quieter but equally thorough. After the death of Edward VII in 1910, the private rooms that had been used for decades to manage the complex choreography of royal affairs, the sitting rooms where Alice Keppel had charmed ministers, the corridors where servants had learned to look the other way, were slowly renovated. The new king, George V, was a man of unshakable domesticity, deeply devoted to his wife, Queen Mary, and he regarded the loosely managed morality of his father's court with a distaste that bordered on revulsion. Under his reign, the palace apartment that might have housed a new official mistress was never designated. The position simply evaporated. The keys that had once opened doors for a maîtresse en titre were retired to some dusty drawer in the Lord Chamberlain's office, and the courtiers who had once specialized in the discreet management of royal liaisons found their skills abruptly obsolete. The architecture, deprived of its function, became merely architecture, but the physical traces proved harder to erase than the social protocols. In the decades that followed, workmen renovating the older wings of European palaces occasionally stumbled upon the remnants of the old arrangements, a concealed door behind a tapestry, a narrow staircase that led nowhere, a room too small to be a formal chamber, but too finely decorated to be a servant's closet. At the Royal Palace of Madrid, a hidden passageway discovered during restorations in the 1970s was found to connect the king's private study to a suite of rooms that had once belonged to a favored lady-in-waiting, whose name the official records had carefully omitted. At the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, a sealed corridor behind a bookcase in the imperial apartments was uncovered during electrical work, its walls still papered with the faded silk of a forgotten boudoir. Each discovery was greeted with a mixture of scholarly interest and institutional embarrassment, and in almost every case, the response was the same. The passage was resealed, the room reclassified as storage, the evidence filed away in archives marked restricted. The palaces, it seemed, were determined to forget, even as their own walls refused to cooperate. The Red House in Bournemouth, Lily Langtry's retreat, survived into the 20th century as a hotel and later a private residence. Its connection to the future King Edward VII reduced to a local legend that new owners would repeat to guests with a mixture of pride and bemusement. The Bijou Palace in Munich, Lola Montez's extravagant gift from King Ludwig, was damaged in the Second World War and later demolished, its site now occupied by an unremarkable office building where workers eat lunch on benches that give no hint of the scandal that once consumed the kingdom. The mansion on Bererstrasse, her earlier residence, suffered a similar fate, its stones carted away during post-war reconstruction, its memory surviving only in a few yellowing photographs in the Munich city archives. The architecture that had once proclaimed the power of royal mistresses was, in the end, no match for the bulldozer and the bomb. But the most poignant erasure occurred not in the palaces of Europe, but in the social memory of the institution itself. By the middle of the 20th century, the idea of an official royal mistress with designated apartments seemed as remote as powdered wigs and sedan chairs. The abdication of Edward VIII in 1936 had exposed the fatal weakness of the old system. It required a public willing to look the other way, and by the era of radio broadcasts and newsreels, the public was no longer willing. When the new king, George VI, and his Queen Elizabeth, the parents of the late Queen Elizabeth II, presented themselves to the nation as a devoted couple whose private life was beyond reproach, they were not merely expressing personal preference. They were enacting a strategic rebranding of the monarchy itself, a deliberate retreat from the louche and formality of the Edwardian era into a fortress of middle-class respectability. The hidden staircases were not merely sealed, they were repudiated. The entire concept of the maîtresse en titre was reclassified from an accepted feature of court life to a shameful anachronism, something that had happened in France, in Bavaria, in the bad old days, but could never happen now. Yet even as the palaces scrubbed their floor plans of any trace of the former arrangement, the human legacy of the system persisted in unexpected ways. The descendants of the women who had once inhabited those apartments went on to live lives that were, in their own ways, shaped by the architecture of their ancestry. Alice Keppel's daughters, Violet and Sonia, grew up at the edge of a world that was already vanishing. Violet Keppel, in particular, became the center of a scandal that seemed to echo the patterns of the previous generation, conducting a passionate affair with the writer Vita Sackville-West that scandalized Edwardian society and inspired Virginia Woolf's novel Orlando. The daughter of the king's mistress became the muse of one of the most famous novels of the 20th century, a literary transmutation that would have amused her pragmatic mother, who had always understood that power, whether personal or political, could be stored in unexpected vessels. The thread of influence, having woven through the apartments of Versailles and the drawing rooms of Portman Square, now wound its way into the pages of a novel, a ghost of the old system still whispering its secrets. And then there was the great-granddaughter, Camilla Shand, born in 1947, the same year Alice Keppel died, would grow up to become the most famous royal mistress of the late 20th century, and then, in a twist that would have made her great-grandmother laugh with a mixture of disbelief and professional admiration, she would become Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. The affair between Camilla and Charles, Prince of Wales, began in the 1970s, when both were married to other people, and it was conducted with a degree of publicity that Alice Keppel would have considered catastrophic. The press, now fully weaponized as a global gossip machine, documented every meeting, every whispered phone call, every awkward public appearance where the two were in the same room. In 1992, the publication of a transcript of an intimate conversation between Charles and Camilla, the so-called Camillagate tapes, exposed the relationship to a level of scrutiny that no previous royal mistress had ever endured. Here was the ultimate inversion of the old architecture. Instead of a private staircase, there were tabloid headlines. Instead of a loyal household staff sworn to silence, there were anonymous sources leaking to reporters. Instead of a queen who tolerated the arrangement for the sake of stability, there was a public that debated every detail on morning television. Alice Keppel, that master of discretion, would have been appalled. And yet, the story did not end in disaster. The monarchy, having absorbed the lessons of the abdication crisis, did not crumble. Instead, the institution slowly, painfully reconfigured itself to accommodate a reality that would have been unthinkable in Alice's day. The mistress could become the wife. Charles and Camilla married in 2005, a civil ceremony followed by a religious blessing, and in 2023, she was crowned Queen Camilla at Westminster Abbey. The private staircase had become a public aisle. The hidden apartment had become a shared palace. The 300-year-old system that had separated the political marriage from the personal attachment had finally collapsed. Not because the monarchy abolished the distinction, but because public opinion had evolved to the point where the distinction no longer seemed necessary. If a king could marry for love, the entire apparatus of the maîtresse en titre was redundant. The architectural memory of the old arrangement, however, lingers in places that most visitors never see. At Versailles, if you know the right person, you can still visit the ground-floor apartments that Madame de Pompadour occupied after her physical relationship with the king had ended, the rooms where she hosted her salons and advised on matters of state. The walls are decorated in the style of the period, the furniture carefully restored, but the guidebooks rarely mention that this was the most powerful woman in France, ruling not from a throne but from a drawing room. At Buckingham Palace, the private apartments of Edward VII have been absorbed into the working offices of the modern monarchy, their original purposes obscured by decades of renovation. But a handful of staff members will tell you, off the record, that certain rooms still have an odd layout, a door that opens onto a blank wall, a cupboard that is deeper than it should be, as if the building itself remembers what the institution has forgotten. The most remarkable survival, however, is not a room but a letter. In the archives of the Château de Versailles, preserved among the documents of the royal household, is a letter written by Madame de Pompadour to a friend in 1751, the year she moved from the intimate attic apartment to the grander ground-floor suite. In it, she describes the move with a characteristic mixture of wit and melancholy. She writes that she has traded a staircase for a garden, that her new windows face the morning sun, and that she can no longer hear the king's footsteps above her at night. She does not say that she misses him. She does not need to. The architecture of the letter itself, its careful restraint, its elegant deflection of sorrow, conveys more than any confession could. The staircase had been the geography of intimacy, and without it, she was merely a very wealthy woman, living in a very beautiful palace, important but no longer essential. She understood, as all successful royal mistresses eventually understood, that the building was never just a building. It was a map of the heart. And so the final question that this long history of hidden doors and secret staircases leaves us with is not whether the system was moral, or even whether it was sustainable. The question is what it tells us about the relationship between power and architecture, between the public life of institutions and the private lives of the people who inhabit them. For 300 years, European monarchies solved a persistent problem, the problem of a king who needed both a political wife and a personal companion, by building the solution into the very walls of their palaces. The arrangement was neither purely secret nor purely public. It was choreographed, a dance of visibility and concealment that allowed the institution to function while satisfying the human needs of the individuals at its center. When the walls finally became transparent, when the cameras and the newspapers and the mass public rendered the choreography impossible, the dance ended. But the palaces remain, and if you stand quietly in the right corner of the right room, you might still feel the faint pressure of all those lives, pressing against the plaster, all those footsteps ascending staircases that no longer exist, all those doors closing softly on stories that the official records chose to forget. The last royal mistress to leave her official apartment did so in 1936, not with a dramatic exit, but with the quiet removal of a few personal items from a room that had been declining in relevance for decades. She was not famous. Her name has been mostly lost to history, overshadowed by the larger drama of the abdication that same year. Her apartment, in a minor German palace that had survived the First World War, only to be absorbed into a museum trust, was repurposed as office space for curators. The desk that now occupies the spot where her bed once stood holds a computer and a stack of catalogs. The curators, when asked about the room's former occupant, will smile and change the subject. The walls, however, are still painted the same shade of pale blue that she chose in 1923, a color too delicate to justify the expense of repainting. And so she lingers, a ghost of an arrangement that once shaped the map of European power, invisible to the tourists who shuffle past the door on their way to the throne room, but present nonetheless, waiting for someone to notice that the architecture still holds her shape. This quiet persistence of lost rooms and forgotten women is not just a curiosity of royal palaces. It is a condition of all old buildings, and perhaps of history itself. Every city that has stood long enough contains inside its walls the floor plans of lives that have been erased, repurposed, and painted over so many times that even the current occupants cannot say for certain what happened in the room that is now a coat closet, or why the hallway bends at an odd angle just before the fire escape. The hidden staircases of Versailles and Buckingham Palace are only the most extravagant examples of a universal truth. Architecture absorbs the lives that pass through it, and it holds on to them, sometimes for centuries, long after the official records have decided they are not worth remembering. Consider the building where you are listening to this right now. It may be a modern apartment with clean lines and neutral paint, or an old house with creaking floorboards and a fireplace that hasn't been used in decades. Behind its walls, inside its ceiling spaces, beneath its floorboards, there are layers of previous choices, a doorway that was sealed over when a room was divided, a chimney breast that still carries the soot of a fire lit 100 years ago, a painted-over window that once looked out on a street that no longer exists. These are not secrets in the dramatic sense. They are simply the residue of occupancy, the physical proof that other people, with their own loves and disappointments and private arrangements, moved through this space before you. The architecture that once housed royal mistresses was a formal, deliberate version of this same phenomenon, the embedding of intimate life into the structure itself, so that the building became not merely a shelter, but a document. What makes the story of the royal mistresses so compelling, even now, is that it forces us to confront the gap between what institutions proclaim and what they actually do. For 3 centuries, the public face of monarchy was built around the sanctity of marriage, the divine approval of the royal union, the moral authority of the crown. And yet the same institution, at the same time, was meticulously carving out space for another kind of relationship entirely, one that was not sanctioned by the church but was too useful to be suppressed. The hidden apartments were not a failure of the system. They were the system's most ingenious solution to a problem it could not solve by other means. They allowed a king to be 2 people at once, the public monarch bound by duty and tradition, and the private man seeking comfort and companionship. The staircase that connected the king's chambers to the mistresses' rooms was, in a sense, the most honest piece of architecture in the entire palace, because it admitted what the throne room could not, that power is always accompanied by loneliness, and loneliness will always find a way to build itself a door. The end of that arrangement, as we have seen, was not brought about by a sudden moral awakening. It was brought about by glass, by cameras and printing presses and radio broadcasts and all the technologies that made it impossible for the public to pretend it did not see what the architecture had been designed to hide. The palaces did not become more transparent because the royals became more virtuous. They became more transparent because the public demanded to look, and the walls, however thick, could not withstand the collective pressure of millions of eyes. This is, in its way, a hopeful fact. It suggests that institutions can change, not because they want to, but because the people they serve will no longer accept the old choreography. The hidden staircase was, ultimately, no match for the newspaper photograph. The private apartment could not survive the newsreel. The quiet arrangement that had worked for generations collapsed the moment it was fully illuminated. And yet, the illumination was never total. The palaces still hold their secrets. The curators who sealed the passages and repurposed the rooms did not erase the past. They merely rendered it invisible to the casual visitor. The records that were filed away in archives marked restricted are still there, waiting for a historian with the right credentials and the right questions. The pale blue wall in the German palace, the cupboard that is deeper than it should be at Buckingham, the faded silk of a forgotten boudoir in Vienna. These are not merely accidents of preservation. They are evidence that the past is never truly gone, only dormant, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see the outline of the older arrangement beneath the newer paint. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the architecture we have explored tonight. It is easy to look at history and see only the grand narrative, the treaties and coronations and abdications that fill the textbooks. But the real history, the one that shapes how people actually lived and loved and schemed and survived, is written in smaller letters. It is written in the distance between two doorways. It is written in the angle of a staircase. It is written in the layout of a room that was too small to be a formal chamber, but too fine to be a servant's closet. To read that history, you have to learn to see buildings not as static objects, but as living records of the choices that were made inside them. You have to learn to ask, when you walk through an old palace, not only what happened in this room, but why this room exists at all. The women who occupied those rooms, Madame de Pompadour and Alice Keppel, Lola Montez and Lily Langtry, and the countless others whose names the official records have chosen to forget, were not simply footnotes to the history of monarchy. They were, in their own ways, architects themselves. They shaped the institutions they inhabited, bending the rigid structures of court protocol to accommodate their presence, carving out spheres of influence that extended far beyond their private apartments. They understood, as all skilled operators understand, that space is a form of power, and that proximity is a form of access, and that the careful management of both can achieve what formal titles and official positions cannot. They were not queens, but they ruled from rooms that were often nearer to the heart of power than the queen's own chambers. The architecture that housed them was both a gift and a cage, a privilege and a constraint, and they navigated its contradictions with a skill that deserves to be remembered. So tonight, as you settle into whatever room you call your own, spare a thought for those vanished apartments and the women who once walked their floors. Consider the hidden staircases that still exist, sealed but not destroyed, behind the walls of buildings that are now open to the public, their secrets resting quietly in the dark. Think of the palace at Versailles, where tourists shuffle past the ground-floor rooms that once belonged to the most powerful woman in France, and of Buckingham Palace, where a cupboard that is deeper than it should be holds no more than cleaning supplies. The architecture has not forgotten. It is only waiting for someone to ask the right question, to look at the floor plan with fresh eyes, to notice the gap between one door and the next and wonder what it was designed to hide. And perhaps, when you next walk through an old building, you will find yourself looking at the walls a little more closely. You will notice the door that leads nowhere, the window that was bricked up long ago, the inexplicable thickness of a particular wall that suggests a passage once ran behind it. You will understand that every building is a palimpsest, a document that has been written over many times, and that with patience and attention, you might learn to read the older layers beneath the newer ones. History does not only live in books. It lives in bricks and mortar, in plaster and paint, in the empty space where a staircase used to be. And if you listen carefully, in the quiet of the night, you might just hear the faint echo of a door closing, a key turning, a footstep on a stair that no longer exists. Thank you for walking these hidden corridors with me tonight. If this journey through the secret apartments of history has eased your mind into that soft space between waking and sleep, consider leaving a like and subscribing if you haven't already, so these quiet stories can find you again when you need them. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far these tales travel through the night. Now close your eyes, let the last image settle in your mind, and rest knowing that the walls around you hold their own stories, and that tomorrow, if you look closely enough, you might just catch a glimpse of them. Sleep well.